Well, welcome everybody on this lovely Auckland evening. I think our attendance has been marred by climate change. And, you know, bridges being closed and open and tsunami alerts going on and all sorts at the minute. But these are unsettled times. But we have assembled a top table here to talk about the budget that we just came through, which was miserable, which was crap, and which doesn't do anything for the poor, the working class, or for climate change. And we have some of the leading campaigners, both from the union movement and the environmental movement today, to talk about how we could do better. And what we really need to do is tax the rich. Unite Union argues that workers shouldn't pay any tax at all, actually. People who create wealth should not be punished for that, and the people that should be punished are the ones who hoard wealth, like the incredible rich, the billionaire class, and a lot of the people who own property in this country. So we have Mike Treen, who's going to be our first speaker, from Unite Union, who's going to talk about the economic context of the budget. Our second speaker is Elliot Cressan. He's going to talk about why we need to tax the rich. The third is Ricardo Mendinez March, Green MP and candidate for here in Mount Albert, on what would a Green Party budget look like. Bianca Ranson from Protect Putiki will be what would a budget by Maori for Maori look like. Brooke Stanley Powell, coordinator of Auckland Action Against Poverty, is going to talk what would a budget to end poverty look like. Edward Miller, researcher and policy analyst at First Union, is going to talk about what would a budget for workers look like. And lastly, Sophie, spokesperson for Fridays for Future, Tamaki Makaro, what would a budget for the climate look like? We got a good load of speakers. They're going to speak for how long each?
8 minutes.
8 minutes each. I'm going to be quite tight in that. And then we'll have questions and answers afterwards and a bit of a debate. Then we'll ask you to stay for a few beers and socialise, because that's where the real planning comes up. We do have the climate strike coming up Friday, 26th of May, so we're going to make a big push for that with other unions to try and get people on that. So our first speaker put it together for Unite Unions, Mike Treen.
Now, I might surprise you by saying that that for the summary of the budget, I'm going to use the New Zealand Herald, and I'm actually going to read their 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6-point summary, because it is actually a good summary of what the budget is and some of the challenges, what's in the budget. So setting the stage for the rest of the people, right? It's a very extremely unambitious budget. You know, whatever, modest, you know, doesn't tackle the fundamental things, but it does some things that we need to understand and know what their implications are, and a few good things that we want to bank. So at a glance, free, and of course, in the budget, they read, the first paragraph was when he read the sort of budget, you know, the hour and a half or whatever, the first paragraph, it had all these main points in it, and so it was sort of over in the first paragraph. You didn't really need to listen to the rest, but I want to look at some of the economics of it. So, free early childhood education for 20 hours a week will be extended to 2-year-olds, saving eligible parents about $133 a week. Subsidies for child care centres rise by 5.3%. Less than inflation, we note at the moment. But public transport will be free for primary school-aged children and half price for those under 25, while bus drivers get pay rises as they move towards the living wage. And that's what I like. I've got a granddaughter who's going to primary school. And I think that one will be popular. The $5 co-payment on prescription is dropped, and the overburdened health system gets $118 million to reduce waiting lists and $100 million to boost primary care. These are actually relatively trivial numbers in the overall context of things, but you know they are. And I like getting rid of that $5 co-payment thing. Is again one of those things that is just good and right. It should never have happened. We had major protests some decades ago when the National Party tried to bring in a $1 prescription fee and we went downhill. We beat it at that time, then getting rid of it finally, it going for good, it hopefully is a good step. Other big spending includes more public housing, home heating and post-cyclone rebuilding, partly offset by a new 39% tax rate for trustees, expected to raise $350 million a year. They are, so the sort of the positive, but again, desperately under what's required, but they are continuing the public housing program by another 3,000 houses, just sort of keeping, but it's 3,000 for 1 year rather than 1 or 2, which it has been up to now each year, 1 or 2,000 each year, but well below the 10,000 a year they could do, and which would actually deal with the problem significantly. But the budget cost is higher than expected, an extra $300 million next year and $500 million in future years in operational spending, and a jump in predicted long-term capital spending from $12 billion to $20.5 billion. Everybody knows the sort of extreme underinvestment that's incurred in infrastructure, so people are expecting a significant boost to some of this capital spending. Now, the final paragraph, economists predict the extra spending could force the Reserve Bank to continue hiking interest rates to reduce inflation. And that's a point that I want to sort of elaborate on, if or sort of look at. Governments in New Zealand have had a, in principle thing, we must have surpluses. Because we must have surpluses. There's no sort of particular economic argument around it. It's just surpluses of good and non-surpluses and deficits are bad. Except when you get in the shit. So when the National Party ran into a shit in the 2008 earthquake, they rapidly went to quite deep budget deficits, even as a percentage of GDP, which is the only way of the numbers. The billions don't mean anything. So I'm just using percentage of GDP. So they went from surpluses every year until 2008, from surpluses that they inherited in 2008, quite quickly to a deficit of 2.1% of GDP in 2009, 3.2% GDP 10, 8.9% of GDP 2011, 4.3% of GDP, and then coming out, going back to surplus again, 2% of GDP, minus 2% in 2013, minus 1.2% in 2014. So they kept, and then 2015 to 2019 in surplus again. That were surpluses again, National and Labour. 2020, COVID, big jump to minus 7.2% of GDP as a budget deficit. But still less than the peak one that the National Party had, which was minus 8.9% of GDP. Then minus 1.3%, so they started curling it back quite quickly, but then sort of went back to 1.3% of GDP, but I think they started getting worried about the impact, and then it has expanded to 2.7% of GDP in this year, and they estimate 1.8 and 1.8% of GDP. Now, deficits can be inflationary, and printing money can be inflationary, and a little bit depends on when it occurs in the business cycle, when the money is thrown in. But this time we have had peak business cycle in a sense with the post-COVID recovery, peak inflation, and quite high budget deficits. And that was why which are and can be inflationary in those circumstances, and also the Reserve Bank printing money and giving it to big business and property speculators, which was directly and immediately inflationary in the property market with a 30% jump in prices. So they created the inflation, right? They try to blame workers for the inflation or say we need wage restraints before the inflation. But the inflation was way ahead of what workers' wages were, and workers have only been trying to catch up since. But we do have now a tension, I think, between what the Reserve Bank, because we have relatively high inflation, 6 or 7%, we have, from their point of view, capitalist point of view, low unemployment. They want, the Reserve Bank governor is openly saying we will create more unemployment in order to create a recession, in order to bring inflation down, in order to, that's their theories, right? And then he has directly said to the government in one of his recent speeches, if you don't increase your tax revenue, then you must slash deficit spending. And I suspect more than what is being done here, to be honest, right, is what the Reserve Bank governor. So if I'm going to put money on it, I'll say the next increase in the Reserve Bank rate is, I think, more likely to be 0.5 than 2.5, but 0.25, I mean, percent. So we have a tension between a Reserve Bank determined to kill inflation, because inflation reduces the wealth of the 1%, and the Reserve Banks serve all around the world 1%, right? Right? It's reducing their wealth. They hate inflation. They will kill inflation, and they'll kill jobs and the economy in order to break inflation. But we shouldn't think that just printing money or running budget deficits is an answer either. That's why we do need to tax the rich. They have been outside of it. They have been outside of the tax system. Tax paid by banks, by major companies, is a voluntary activity. Tax paid by the 1% is not a voluntary activity for us. It is theoretically possible to avoid the inflation, to avoid the budget deficit, but the only way you can do that is by taxing the rich.
Yeah.
Our next speaker, Elliot Crossan from System Change Aotearoa, and why we need to tax the rich.
Thank you on behalf of System Change to everyone who's come today and to all of our speakers. I enjoy watching the debates in the House on Budget Day because it's effectively the leader of the opposition, one of the Chris's, will stand up and he'll go, capitalism has failed on all of these fronts, and then the government will go, but we're managing capitalism fine, and they don't say it's because capitalism's failed, they say it's because Labour's failed or National's failed. The reality is, whoever's in power, capitalism has failed our people immensely. The top 1% hold 20% of the wealth. The top 10% hold 60% of the wealth. And the bottom 50%, I imagine a lot of us would be in that category, hold just 6.7%. And when they released the IRD survey last month about the tax system, it showed firstly that the 311 richest households in the country have more wealth than almost half of New Zealanders, and secondly that they pay less than half the tax rate of the average worker, and that could be even lower if you factor in GST. It could be as little as a third as much that they pay, which is, well, shocking in a way, but also I don't think people are that surprised that the rich don't pay much tax. And so as Mike outlined, under pressure from inflation, under pressure from the Reserve Bank and from the opposition accusing them of overspending, the government had two options. One of them was to tax the rich, and the other one was to deliver a nothing budget that does so little for people that we can barely tell the difference. You know, that's not to say the things that they did do are bad, but when we've got crisis like this, it's just pathetic. And this has been a government generally tinkering around the edges of the system rather than trying to fix major problems. And I'd say this is their worst budget yet for that. We didn't even see the above inflation benefit increases, the above inflation minimum wage increases, for example, that we've seen in the past. Where am I on here? Yes, so, I'm sure I don't have to tell everyone about the climate crisis. Look at how much rain we've had. There was a brilliant graph in the spin-off. I've got a very small version here, which shows this year, and this is before this last week. The amount of rainfall we've had is miles ahead of any other year in Auckland so far. And, Aotearoa is not going to be the worst affected country by climate change. We're going to have Pacific Islands going underwater. We're going to have huge droughts, huge famines across the world. That is a colossal crisis. The inequality crisis is terrible. I've got another graph. It's probably too small for people to see again, but the housing crisis is the worst in the OECD. Maybe I could pass this around, just kind of flick through the graphs. If you like graphs like I do. And we've got low wages, and we've got, I think it's 1 in 10 children experience material hardship, and that's 1 in 5 for tamariki Māori, which is just disgusting that our country operates like that. There are solutions. We know the solutions. But the fundamental thing is, and the reason why we call this Tax the Rich, a budget for people and planet tax the rich, is because all of those solutions to big structural issues can only happen if we take on the interests of the top 1% aggressively in the interests of everyone else. And Labour has constantly proved that they're just not willing to do that. But that's the only way we're really going to get solutions. They'd have to tax the rich. What would those solutions be if, say, the people around this table had influence, if, say, everyone here had influence? If the majority of people had a budget in their interests, I think we'd have 10,000 state houses a year and rent controls, at the very least until the crisis is fixed. We'd have public ownership and investment in public transport, energy, water, areas of health and education where things are inadequate right now. We'd have pay rises for teachers and for nurses, and for bus drivers as well, although they are getting a bit of a pay rise. Have a living wage for everyone, guaranteed livable incomes for everyone, a Green New Deal granting a job to anyone who wants one, to transition rapidly away from fossil fuels in a fair way. And we could cut taxes for workers, as Joe said at the start. GST is a tax that affects you more the poorer you are, and we don't have an income tax-free threshold in this country. We should have both of those things. So in conclusion, what is the purpose of System Change Aotearoa? Our group, we've called a few meetings now. I'm sure some of you have been to some before. We believe that it's desperately time to build a coalition of trade unionists, of social movements, tangata whenua, the environmental movement, movement against poverty, and also the Green Party and Te Pāti Māori, in order to force Labour to finally deliver on the transformational change that Jacinda Ardern promised quite a few times when she was coming into office, and just simply hasn't delivered. I believe that the Green Party and Te Pāti Māori should agree on a set of common transformational demands that they would force Labour to implement if they had the numbers, and that there should be a huge movement in support of that. Because this election is a chance if, on the one hand, enough people support the Greens and Te Pāti Māori, and on the other hand, if they are willing to offer real transformation and to force Labour to do it, this election could be a chance for that kind of change. And finally, I'd like to propose to the people in the room and organisations present, if you're interested, I believe we should have a protest or a rally to tax the rich at some point during this election campaign. Get as many progressive groups in the room, at the rally as possible. Maybe in the room if it's raining. as it may be, because, the cannabis referendum last election, right? I believe part of the reason that failed is because it was COVID, people weren't doing rallies and protests, so there were no big mobilizations in favor of that. We're not going to get a wealth tax unless we actually mobilize for it, because the top 1% are constantly mobilizing in their interests. They've got the media, they've got the money, they've got the bond markets, all of those things. We have the power of the people, and we need to mobilize that in order to try and fight for some of these demands during the election. The alternative is just more tinkering around the edges from Labour, maybe even austerity, as Mike kind of alluded to there. They might have to go in that direction. The Reserve Bank might force them, or a national enact government, which is just going to devastate our communities, especially with ACT looking so strong right now. So let's fight for that during this election.
So as well as organising resistance on the streets and in the workplaces, we have resistance in the Parliament as well. Ricardo has been a champion for migrant workers, helping to win the RV21 visa last year, but we still have lots more work to do from Labour. And Ricardo is going to speak now on what would a Green Party budget look like.
And I'm gonna put the timer on to make sure I stick to my 8 minutes. Us politicians are trying to speak way longer than we should. But kia ora koutou. My name is Ricardo Menendez, and I am your Green Party's spokesperson for social development, immigration, senior citizens, sports, community, commerce and consumer affairs, and senior citizens and tourism as well. We need more green MPs so that the burden is a lot lighter than each of us holding a million portfolios. But in terms of reflections on the budget, I think, like Mike and Elliot said, I think we can all acknowledge that there were some okay bits. Those prescription fees were terrible, and the co-payments were a barrier for people to access medicines. But the reality is we still have people getting sick from preventable illnesses because kids are living in moldy and damp, cold homes. We still have people avoiding going to the dentist because it costs them money. And while the Reserve Bank is hiking up inflation and encouraging government to spend less, corporates are making more money. And actually, the flow of money is going into the hands of the wealthiest few, while the rest of our population is being told to budget their money and spend less. And so effectively, one of the greatest deflationary tools that we have is taxing the wealthiest few to reform and overhaul, actually, so many of our industries so that they're not so centered in profit. Because, again, while we're all being told to budget more, supermarkets continue making record profits, and so are banks. So for us and the Greens, one of the key priorities from a tax point of view would have been to introduce a wealth tax. Our official policy is indeed to have a tax-free threshold starting at 10K and then exploring what else we need to be done. Hiking up corporate tax, exploring things like a land tax as well, while acknowledging there's complicated things we'll need to do here to recognize how that may interact with Māori land, because land tax isn't just this kind of thing we can apply with kind of brush stroke here. And in terms of access to income support, we would have increased benefits, ended sanctions, and completely reimagine our income support system so that people can thrive and not just survive. We would have also done things like looking at ending the boom and bust of corporations such as in the construction industry, and looking at buying equity shares to start nationalizing our construction companies, which is something that I think we should be moving towards. Because in order for us to scale up the building of public housing, we need to stop relying on corporations that are effectively charging so much money for construction materials and not delivering construction workers the conditions that they deserve. And it is simply not acceptable for Labour to have committed. And while on paper it sounds like 3,000 is a lot, they're only building enough homes. They've committed to building more homes for a year more. That's all they've committed to. And my cynical take is that this is to force National to say what they're going to do after the election when it comes to the public housing stock and where they're going to sell it. But I think our communities deserve far more than just the major parties playing games and trying to bait each other into saying something dumb. I mean, we've seen how National has said something dumb when it comes to the prescription fees, because they now National has managed to somehow say they're going to bring them back, despite it being one of the things that I think even a national government would have done. It's good, but it's kind of so just mild that I would have seen National doing it. And so again, for us in the Greens, it's about going beyond that. It's about expanding the public housing bill. It is about stopping the selling of land that was confiscated and is currently held by Kanga Ora for private developers, because that is still happening under Labour. For all the criticisms that we have of National selling state houses, the current government is, by nature of how they do redevelopments, is still offloading a bunch of land into the hands of private developers. And so we would do those redevelopments in a completely different way to retain that land and to therefore enable pathways to return it. We would also end perpetual leases. We would invest far more into education to pay our teachers better, but also to better equip our teachers to better basically embed things like te reo into our curriculum and actually resource it in the way that it should be. We would have done things like not just think of things like Nature for Jobs as a temporary scheme during COVID, but as a way to actually create capacity and ensuring we have a thriving biodiversity, and having schemes like that as a kind of running thing. We would have done other things such as expanding access to free healthcare for GPs beyond and not having things that are just capped at specific ages, to kind of universalize access to our health and transport system. And that takes me to one of the kind of features in the budget, which was around having free public transport and then have for some, and then you're going to get into this thing where you're just adding layers of enforcement for the bus drivers who are already under massive stress, which and at a time where our services are under strain and our bus drivers are under strain, having this kind of means-tested, age-tested sort of half-fare system just makes no sense. And from my perspective, we should just make fares free and resource our drivers and our services so that we can have free and frequent public transport. Because in Aotearoa, where the bulk of our emissions is coming is from agriculture and our transport and construction industry, we need to be focusing on investments in that area, which would have included things like investing in interregional rail and making resourcing Kiwi Rail so that it's not profit-seeking as a state-owned enterprise, but actually is committed to providing services that put people and climate first. The fact that our rail services are focused on tourism and making a profit just speaks to the lack of priorities that Kiwi Rail has and that our government has when it comes to meeting our climate ambitions. So support the conversation here about taxing the rich. It's absolutely possible. It would drive down inflation, and it could give us the means to provide everything for everyone, as I'm sure Brooke will talk about in the next speech.
Or the next speech after the next speech.
Oh, sorry. I'm just ready for her.
Bianca has been filing to take the Patiki at Waiheke Island. I was stunned when you were doing the stuff with the council to find out that there's nearly 100 helicopter pads out there, which shows what the rich are getting away with. So put together for Bianca.
Kia ora koutou, he mihi nui tēnei ki a koutou, I tai mai ki tēnei hui. I tēnei pō, ko waio he uri tēnei o ngā puhi nui tonu, ko Ngāti Kahuki Whangaroa Te Hapu, ko Bianca Ranson tōku ingoa. Kia ora everybody. So I guess just to start off with, I'd say that the government has produced a budget which doesn't surprise me at all, and it's produced a budget which is completely aligned with the Westminster system. So if we look at the system, it's founded on, at the very core of it is colonialism, capitalism, extraction for profit, and a dig and burn mentality, whether that's for our oceans, whether it's for our people, or whether it's for our whenua. And so for me, the only way that we will ever see a budget that I can support will be if we can see constitutional transformation and a tiriti-centric Aotearoa. And so when I say that, it's because the values of what our tupuna agreed to in Te Tiriti are all about te taiao. They're all about the environment. It's about our whakapapa, to rangi and to papa. And so because we have that whakapapa, we have automatically that responsibility to those tapu relationships with our environment, and that determines how we interact with them. And right now, in terms of what's going on with the twin biodiversity and climate crises, that should be at the heart of any decisions that are guiding our budget. We've seen the impacts here in Auckland with the different flooding events, and just this week we've seen them in Italy. It's almost like the exact same scenes playing out. And so, so for this budget specifically, we've seen less than 0.5% of the budget allocated to Māori. And so we really need to be looking at an equal share in resources and the distribution of resources and the way that they're distributed. Currently, what happens is that if we're talking about funding for Māori, those decisions are predominantly being made by Pākehā within Pākehā systems or organisations, and then they're delegated to Māori. And so there's obviously a lot of work that we need to do, and I think now is really critical, because if we see people continue to be, what really gets me is that so many people seem to be threatened by Māori wanting to have equal share in power and equal share in resources. And when we are still trying to come back from so much, it astounds me that people would be threatened by that. And what we should be looking at is how that is actually going to enhance and make people's lives better. For me, it's likely that I will die 10 years younger than a non-Māori person. We have 100,000 homeless people in this country. Māori are around 16% of the overall population. We're 60% of the homeless population in Aotearoa. 1 in 10 children in this country is living in poverty. 1 in 5 Māori children are living in poverty in this country. And so what we're seeing is a continuation of the rich getting richer. And right now, those in my whānau and whānau that I know, the struggle is, as you know, it's real. Our people have been living in poverty since the arrival of the British. Since our language was stripped from us, since our whenua was taken from us, since it became illegal for us to practice things like our traditional medicines or kaitiakitanga over our whenua. And that Māori and biodiversity is literally what we need right now, even for a livable future, in terms of looking at how we're interacting with te taiao. So there are really huge changes that need to be made. And in terms of tangata whenua here, or Indigenous climate justice, Indigenous social justice, we have such an amazing opportunity in this country to show the world what that can look like. And we can do that in our lifetime. And if we want to see a future that is good for all of us and fair for all of us, we need to do that. And if we're looking at the way that decisions are made around resources, there is no reason why that needs to be coming from one central point. We need to bring it back to our whānau, back to our hapu, back to our iwi, and back to our communities, so that we are all working together and seeing what we can do to help each other, and use that as leverage as well to change what's happening in the government space. Because we need to remind ourselves of our collective power together and the resources and the aroha that we have, and start building on those so that we can really get the momentum going to make the changes that we need to see. I have no idea how long I've been talking for. Okay. Oh, I've still got 4 minutes. Okay, great. Okay, that's good. So I might move on to some of the issues with Te Taiao because I just wanted to kind of reflect on what's happening back in my own rohe where I'm from in Whangaroa. And the government has just given a prospecting permit to one of the wealthiest people in the world, Clive Palmer, who's an Australian billionaire, for a prospecting license for 500 square kilometres, which is just bigger than all of Wellington, to mine our ancestral whenua, including conservation land for minerals. For lithium and for all minerals is under the permit. So this is how ludicrous this system is in a climate crisis with our people who are still still dealing with the government in terms of te tiriti and treaty claims and so on. We're seeing our government, who promised in 2017 that they would end any new mines on conservation land, giving this enormous permit to an Australian billionaire who's just spent $1 billion on replicating the Titanic. So they're literally extracting the heart of our whenua, the minerals out of our whenua, putting our water at risk, our drinking water, in order for someone in another country to go and spend money on things like that. And our government enables people like him and people here in this country to keep on extracting wealth from all of us who have been suffering for generations. And it fundamentally needs to change, and we need to do that through constitutional transformation. We need people to understand what te tiriti is and what a shift towards a tiriti-centric Aotearoa actually means for you and for tangata whenua in terms of equality, our well-being, and most importantly for te taiao. That's probably it from me. Kia ora tātou.
Our next speaker is Brooks Stanley, and Brooks, coordinator of Auckland Action Against Poverty, and Brooks going to talk on what a budget to end poverty looks.
I'm just going to stay seated if that's all good. Is that all good? Kia ora tātou, everyone. I just wanted to thank System Change for hosting the event tonight. To you, Bianca, for opening us in karakia. Thank you for that. To Unite Union for the space. Everyone here who decided to make it out on a windy, wet, cold night, and to all of our speakers as well for the conversations. I guess with a budget to eliminate poverty or without poverty would look like, as Bianca mentioned, poverty is actually a result of colonial violence here in New Zealand, and the ongoing, oh hey Max, impacts of colonial violence. And so in order to eliminate that, I agree we need constitutional transformation via Matike Mai, and everything for everyone, which is the idea that the Crown is responsible for meeting the essential needs of people and planet. I think that's the only way that we're going, like Bianca mentioned, we'll have a livable future, and we need to transition away from a colonial capitalist house to one that's centred to a house that looks after people and planet before money. So, yeah, kia ora.
Kia ora. Looks like he's got a contender for the award. Well, our next speaker is Edward Miller. Edward's a researcher and policy analyst at First Union, and he's going to talk on what would a budget for workers look like.
Kia ora koutou. I think that's a slightly more grandiose version of what I'm going to say. I can't claim to be doing that. I'm going to do two things and maybe try and do a third within the 8 minutes. So I'm a researcher and policy analyst at First Union, and I was asked by the Council of Trade Unions to support their budget analysis. They put together a budget report comes out 6 o'clock the morning after the budget, so you have to be quite ready. So I help them with the transport and housing section, so I'll speak a little bit about those two parts of the budget. Then I'll try and zoom out a little bit and give some reflections on what I thought about the budget broadly. And if I have time, I'll talk a little bit about corporate profits in Aotearoa within the context of the theme of tonight, tax the rich, or something to that effect. So transport being the first part, we represent workers in the transport industry, predominantly bus drivers, truck drivers, Uber drivers. Those would be the main ones, so road transport largely. The government spends a lot of money on transport. We spent $10 billion in this budget, or we're planning to spend $10 billion. That's up like billions and billions of dollars from previous years. Transport grows in line with transport emissions, which grow all the time. And there's a reason for that. We're obsessively car-centric in this country. And things are getting better under a Labour government, but we're still in the same track. So if you go back to the last national government, they spent 80% of the transport budget on roads. We are now down to 67. 2/3 of the transport budget is on roads. So it's a $10 billion budget, roughly $6 or $7 billion on roads. And that doesn't really go very far in an inflationary environment. You keep up the state highways, you build a couple of new ones. You keep up the existing local roads, you build a couple of new ones. There's a bit more new money in this budget for road safety, which is fantastic because too many people die on our roads, and that affects whole lots of things. There's a bit more. We also put the walking and cycling stuff into the roads budget, so that's slightly reduced, but by a couple of hundred million in the context of a $10 billion budget. So it's still, it's a road-centric budget. The rail part has increased over the past couple of years since, the end of the last national government. Spending on rail has tripled, so we've gone from 700 million to about 2.2 billion being spent on rail. Most of that is just keeping up with how shit our rail network is. It's not improving. We can't just jump on a train around the place anymore because of that, billions of dollars. So things are getting slightly better, but we're pushing a lot of shit to stay in the exact same place, essentially, in the rail space. There's a few cool initiatives in this new area called emissions reduction, which we've only had for a couple of years. And we mentioned already bus driver wage increases, which is fantastic, where the bus drivers are the first workers in the country to have an approved fair pay agreement move forward. And that will go into negotiation about the beginning of July. So basically the government's getting their ducks in a row because they'll end up paying most of the wage increase, even though private equity funds that run our public transport network will take bucket loads of cash out of the country, and we could talk about that later. The other cool thing in the emissions reduction budget, which has probably already been talked about, is the half-price free fares and for very young and kind of young people, and there's super gold cards and concessions as well, so together, that's about 145 million that we're spending to reduce public transport. But by the looks of most of us in this room, I don't know if anyone's going to get the benefit. Super gold, I'm sorry. Fantastic. Look, transport increases massively every year, and we get very little extra for it. If you look at how much we're spending, 109 million plus 36 million on those fare concessions relative to the $10 billion we're spending, we could be getting a lot more free public transport, a lot more expanded public transport networks for the money that we end up spending on motorways, which ends up going to large international contracting firms, blah, blah, blah. I'll step into housing very quickly, and it's kind of been touched on a little bit. Housing is spread across a whole bunch of different departments, but I'll really just talk about a couple of things. The good news is there's more money to insulate houses, so less people getting black lung and that kind of thing. That's fantastic. Yeah, and it's all Green Party pressure from many years back. It doesn't really touch the sides of things. I think that looking at the kind of funding around state housing is quite interesting because it's in some ways it's like a macro understanding of where this budget is at. We had a multi-year allocation. Well, let me rewind a little bit. We didn't build state houses for 30 years in this country, and we started selling them off at the end of the last government. So the estate was looking pretty shit, to be honest. No disrespect to people who have to live in state houses, but the stock was very poor quality and we didn't update them and all that kind of thing. We have built in Kāinga Ora something that delivers state houses. So that is something that we can all be kind of happy about it existing. We've built 12,000 new ones since the beginning of this government. The there was Kāinga Ora wrote to the government midway through last year and basically said, we've got no more money. Building houses is really expensive. You need to give us a bit more money. And if we don't get more money, we're going to have to start doing what the Nats did and sell off state houses. We'll sell them into the affordable housing space, but we're still going to have to sell off state houses. So that's why you've seen the government cough up money. But it hasn't been a multi-year allowance, which is what we've previously had. It's 1 year it's not even for this year, it's for the next year. 3.1 billion to build 3,000 state houses. Again, we have lots of migrant workers coming into this country, welcome them into this country, of course, but as the Productivity Commission says, we can't keep bringing people into this country without building more houses when we already have extreme stress amongst people living in this country. We need to get better at building houses, and that's not really ticked off within the housing budget. I'll just zoom back a little bit now and talk about housing and within the economy in general. The big thing that's going on in the economy right now is the Reserve Bank is hiking interest rates really aggressively right now. We've gone from 0.25% to 5.25% in about 18 months. Right, that means the cost of borrowing is a lot more. It means that it's hard to create new jobs. It's hard to keep existing jobs. It's hard to create new mortgages. It's hard to keep existing mortgages. Everybody's losing in this process so that we can keep the bank's profit margins happy. I think that's how it works. Fundamentally now, we haven't booked any new houses for development for about 18 months. So the rate of housing construction is collapsing very, very quickly. And the 50,000 construction workers that we've trained since the beginning of the pandemic are starting to see that they're not going to have work within the next couple of months. Lots and lots of construction workers in this country are contractors, not employees, so you don't have to fire them. They're tenure finishers, and then, my hope is that when they go to Australia, they join the CFMEUs because they have a fighting organising union in the construction industry over in Australia. We have this tension, and maybe you call it a tug of war, between what the Reserve Bank is doing on one side and what Treasury is trying to do on the other side, or the government's trying to do and Treasury stopping them from doing it. We're trying to create more out of nothing, we have an inflationary environment, and as a result of that, we have a contraction within this budget. So talking about the really big numbers of the budget, they're proposing to spend $128 billion, right? They're saying $4.8 billion is the operational allowance. So that's new spending coming into the economy. 80% of that is keeping the lights on, dealing with the inflation costs of the existing departments. So you've got about between $800 million and $1 billion worth of new spending coming into this budget. The response from, and so that's nothing, right? It's less than 1%. It's a contractionary budget. It's an austerity budget. I think it's about 2.1% less on a GDP per capita basis. Anyway, it's an austerity budget. The response from the banks that we saw was, oh shit, there's too much spending that's going to take place. So the banks are now saying, well, we're going to have to the Reserve Bank is going to have to push interest rates even further next Wednesday when they'll announce the next interest rate hike. Mike suggested it could be a 0.5. I would not be surprised if it's a 0.5. And they're saying that interest rates could get right up to 6%. It takes, according to the Reserve Bank, it takes 18 months for an interest rate hike to work its way through the economy. We started hiking in October 2021. So right now is when the unemployment cycle starts to begin over the next couple of months. And the further through it you get, the further through the cycle of hikes you get. So that's when we can expect to start seeing people become unemployed. How do you deal with the fact that you have a budget, you have a Reserve Bank that says you can't spend any money, but you have a cost of living crisis? Well, there's only one thing that can change, really, and that's that we have to attack the profitability of corporations in this country. From 2020 to 2022, corporate profits rose from $46 billion a year to $70 billion a year. Corporate profits are the tax that working people pay all the time, constantly through every transaction we have to deal with. People are getting very rich from paying corporate profits, and if we want to bring down the cost of goods, we need to reduce the proportion of profit margin that capitalists are making. We could try and do that through corporate taxes, but I think maybe a more progressive way would be to even look at regulating profit margins themselves, which sounds kind of radical, but we've actually just done it in the petrol industry. Petrol now, you can't have a profit margin of more than 17 cents per litre. It was up to about 60 cents per litre during the height of the post-Ukraine Russian invasion. We have many commodities where we could look at doing this, and many other goods in our supermarkets where we could look at doing this. This reduces inflation, reduces costs for working people, but it makes it easier for government to do the job of dealing with the Reserve Bank. We need to go on and actually reform these policies, but we have a budgetary problem now. Let's tackle profit. That's my proposal.
And finally, our last speaker for tonight, Sophie Todd. Sophie's the spokesperson for Fridays for the Future, Tamaki Macaro, and organising the upcoming climate strike on Friday 26th of May, which we're asking everybody to mobilise for. And Sophie's going to talk on what would a budget for the climate be.
Kia ora, ko tēnei takumihi ki ngā tangata whenua o te rohe nei, ka mihi hoki hoki ki ngā toho o te rohe nei. My name is Sophie, Sophora, and a budget for climate, what would it look like? I mean, I am just a regular person, I'm not an economist, I'm not particularly skilled and researched in any of these things. I'm just a regular person, and I have my eyes open, and I can see that there is a worsening inequality problem that we've got. And I'm really interested in how the government chooses to spend its money. We talk about we have all these billions and millions of dollars going to these different areas, but yet when it actually comes time to choose who's going to deliver the services for our city, we're typically always turning towards giant, often international conglomerates and asking them, like, please be a little bit climate friendly while you deliver us a cost-effective service. And I'm interested into how and why our government isn't engaging in social procurement. We have so many charities, passionate people, community groups that are expected to be moving real outcomes on climate just from volunteer hours, just from the goodness of our hearts, without getting resource or with, piddly little annual grants they have to continually reapply for. And then these heavy-hitting 20-year contracts, billions of dollars contracts are going to these, known abusers with the caveat of, like, please try a little harder. And I think it's really unambitious, and it's really stink that we're not actually looking to the people that are started from a place of kaupapa, started from a place of caring. And I think it's really about the culture that we have here in Aotearoa currently, which is where we just have a government that's so used to operating as a business. I would imagine a budget for climate would be where we start looking as our city as more like a giant family. How do we get everyone fed? How do we take care of everyone here? And yeah, so I've been pretty shocked and interested about the kind of culture difference that the people that are in leadership have got to the people that are on the ground. And it's sort of quite sobering for me has been recently engaging with challenging Wayne Brown against his current, budget cuts. The first protest that we had going into that meeting, we were expecting them to be talking about maybe details like, what programs are going to be facing the impacts of these cuts, but they were actually talking about the 162nd private helicopter pad going on to Waiheke Island, which was just shocking to me, that's what they're up there talking about, while meanwhile putting out we're going to cut homelessness services, youth services, migrant, refugee. Basically, every marginalised community is facing these cuts. So it's just kind of interesting to me that we have this big culture of people in the position of power are so either afraid of challenging a capitalist way of thinking, or they directly benefit from it. And you mentioned that really rich Australian billionaire who also invested, by the way, like $500,000 into Wayne Brown's mayoral candidacy. So we have it's like right in front of us that we have all of this, and it's not these rich people aren't donating to politics, they're investing in politics to get the outcomes that they want. And that's not talked about enough. Also, there's like all this budget and stuff going into housing and developing more housing. Great, we need more housing. Actually, there's less homeless in Auckland than there are empty homes. So maybe if instead of looking at how we can spend all of this money to create more homes, or who's going to be able to buy those homes, and also if we're looking at people at the top that are moving further and further towards wealth, more and more and more wealth that they're accruing, we can all worry about where we're spending our taxpayer dollars, but these guys aren't paying. These guys aren't paying their fair share. They're not contributing back to our economy. They're benefiting from it. So it's just a culture thing. We have rich supermarkets, rich landlords, rich banks. We have nurses, firefighters, teachers, librarians, social services, non-profits, bus drivers, environmentalists, all begging to survive. Like these are all the things that create a hallmark of a great city. Art, culture, public transport, libraries. They make a great city. They make us great. So I guess the question I've got is, what makes us rich? Is it private helicopter pads? Or is it libraries? Is it social services? I think if there's any time to challenge yourself to vote more radically, it's this election. We've got 6 years and about 90 days, last I checked, to have a shot at keeping the world to 1.5 degrees. That's science. We have no idea really what the numbers are, but that's kind of what the best science is now. So that's 2 election terms left on that. So the things that we're doing now, the government that we've got in now, it needs to be drastically better than what we've got. So if you are voting in the centre, I really encourage you to engage with Te Pāti Māori, with the Greens, and really push yourself to go, maybe I've been maybe I've been a little bit gentle with our political system. We can actually push them a lot more and engage a lot more with how we can see this culture shift, because that's what we really need. What do we value? I get really pissed off. I go on YouTube, get those ads coming up like, do you want to get a super yacht like me? Do you want to have a private jet like me? Like, why are we getting fed that shit? Sorry. It's irritating. It's irritating to me. I want to see a budget for climate is where people are concerned less with careers and more concerned with the carers in their community. What is actually creating resilience in our community? In Wayne Brown's budget cut, he's proposing cutting $20 million from community services and increasing the government's budget for flood preparedness by $20 million. When we did have the floods, who was responding? Because I think Wayne Brown was like missing his tennis game, but we were literally out there with the buckets. So, I don't understand that, and I really want to question it. The construction industry, the roads, as you were saying. What is currently stopping these industries from just continually charging more while delivering less? This isn't about where we're spending our money. This is about actually regulating industry. And I would like to see meaningful regulation for industry, which is creating huge wealth for itself while delivering less and less for the people. My final kind of frustration point, and this is a bit of a rant really, but I'm mad about it, is so we signed the Paris Agreement. If we don't meet our obligations under the Paris Agreement of reducing our emissions, we have to pay. And since we've signed the Paris Agreement, we've got an emissions reduction scheme. We've declared a climate emergency. We've got climate action frameworks. So schemes, frameworks, declarations, where's the laws? Where's the regulation and the policy that is actually legally binding to make the people that are harming our planet pay for that harm? Because we're still allowing them to extract from our world, to take from our natural environment, to take from our communities, and asking them very nicely to please do a little bit better, and maybe you could make some reports about how you're going to try and do better. All of that is completely made up. It's completely fabricated as how we run our nation, how we choose to run our nation, what is important to us. Having a surplus is important to us, but why? What does it mean for the people? Politicians and industry, very close together. They're very tight, because that's where a lot of the money's coming from, is industry. But we keep going, okay, we need to pay for this, we need the money, we need the investment from these wealthy organizations that are making money from hurting our planet to pay for climate change. I think we actually need to stop looking at getting them to give piecemeal funds, and we need to start regulating how much money they're making through policy, through industry regulation. I guess the final thing I want to talk about is there's actually heaps more. But the mayor, he said when we first started going down to protest his budget cuts, he said, I know what those guys are all about, tax the rich and that. Well, taxing the rich is not an option. He said that in the RNZ article. The next day, that was when the article came out about the 311 richest families that hold 50% of the wealth of our nation, pay less tax than the working class, or anyone on welfare. People on welfare paying more tax as per their income than that demographic, that 311 families. A week after that, 100 of those 311 came forward saying, we'd like to pay more tax. So where is it? You know, we're talking about spending all this budget. Imagine how much more money we'd have to invest in the things that actually matter if people that were hurting our planet were paying their fair share. So we have to tax the rich. That's the only way. That's me.
All right, well, just to summarise from all our speakers, I mean, we've got a diverse group of people from both the environmental and the trade union movement. But if we think of how this week started with the tragedy in Wellington that saw 2, maybe 3 of the crises come to a head. We've got a crisis in housing where a lot of poor people have to live in hostels. There's 3 or 4 of them quite close here, with 80 to 100 people living in conditions where I don't know what the sprinklers or alarm system are like in your place, Ellie, but these are the dangers of hundreds of people living in substandard accommodation, that they can be burned to death. We've got a mental health crisis where lots of people who need help are on the streets or in substandard accommodation. And then, of course, we had our own fire service on strike a few months ago. And if Darian Fenton's listening, that strike wasn't just about pay, like our nurses and teachers who are going to strike at the minute. They're not just fighting for fair pay, but they're also fighting for the rest of society, saying we don't have the resources at the minute to deal with the crisis in our schools post-COVID, to deal with the crisis in our wards. Why are nurses, firefighters and teachers going on strike when you told us these were essential workers during the pandemic, and now you're back to the same thing, giving tax breaks to the rich, and we suffer? And I think there's an anger in this country now, that this is not a glib statement about taxing the rich. To take the language away from the right wing and people like Luxon, it's time the left went on the attack about tax and said, working class people shouldn't pay any bloody tax at all. We should abolish GST, which would put money into the hands of people straight away. That's a 15% cut straight away from things like nappies, bread, milk, right? We should control rent. I resent the fact that I have to pay over 50% of my income around this area if I want to live local anymore, right? Because if you're looking, it's $450 for a dive with mould and places they don't even bother to clean. When the estate agents won't give you eye contact, you're going to a festering dump, right? $600 if you want something decent, right? How hell can working class people pay over 50 or 60% of our income now just to live in this country? Unacceptable. And unacceptable that you build 3,000 houses a year or whatever, right? It should be 10,000 a year until we make the private rental market superfluous. We don't need it. It shouldn't be there. There shouldn't be a landlord class. We should build housing for the people. This anger is now so palpable that we can enter into the national arena with it, with parties like the Party Māori and the Greens being necessary for Labour to prop themselves up in the next, as you said, the second last government before irreversible climate change happens. Right? This is why we need radicalism, not just because we're dealing with poverty on such a level that people can't house themselves, feed themselves, or hospitals, schools and fire service are collapsing, and those people are on strike fighting for society, right? And we have the rich, richer than ever before, laughing at us, flaunting their wealth in the face, driving their Lamborghinis up and down outside Prada and all those other shops in Queen Street, right? They've never had it so good, right? Why do the 300 people want to pay more tax, the billionaires, right? Because they know what's coming, anger. And here is a degree of warning. If the left doesn't start moving on this crisis around poverty and housing, the extreme right will. In Ireland, we're a very proud radical left-wing tradition, and a lot of radical left-wing people have been elected, and we hope to form a new government quite soon in Ireland to deal with these crises. But ignore the far right at your peril. When people say about, for example, how we could scapegoat people, going around looking to try and find a place here to live, and all the new migrants are back. You know, there's 10 people from elsewhere also competing for those houses. If that competition continues, there's a material basis for where racism and the far right will reach, and they'll go for simple solutions. It's not the rich that are causing it, it's these new Indians, it's these new Chinese, it's these new people coming in, and we need to burn them out. That's what's happening in Europe. The far right are going on the attack, mobilising working class anger and trying to burn out refugees, attack hostels and attack migrants in the street. So we need to advance this year. And we need to, I think, with this election coming up, you know, let's mobilise, let's march, let's get big organisations all together. So this isn't just a radical dream, if you like, but this is how we're going to intersect with that next second last government. So I'll just throw it open now to the to the audience. And you don't have to ask questions from the panel. It's a democratic forum, so say what you want, say what you like. If you're from an organisation, you know, let us know what your organisation thinks. We will ask people to come back at the end of the thing, so if you're asking a question of people, just if they could jot it down, the answer, the top table will come back there. So. Just pop your hand up and I'll take a speaking order. Just introduce yourself, who you are and where you're from.
Hi, my name is Sam. I'm part of Unite, but I'm just curious. Sophie made a really good point earlier about the state of housing in Auckland specifically, that we have more empty houses than homeless people. Just would like to open that up to the panel. How would you go about solving that problem, at least, you know, incentivizing those houses to be filled with people rather than kept empty for profit?
It's a big issue for us on Waiheke. So because we have like so many wealthy people that have come into our island over more recent years. So I've spent my whole life out on Waiheke, and it used to be a place that was reasonably undesirable for people to live, and that's completely changed, particularly since our fast ferry service came in, and we actually have quite a few billionaires, unfortunately, out on the island. But we have 1/3 of the homes on the island that actually are vacant, and we have the highest homeless population amount of people per population in all of Auckland. So And then we have a massive issue with housing for our workers as well. So vacant homes is, what we're doing at the moment is we're looking to other examples around the world. So there's another example in a place, and this is probably more specific for us because we're in an island community, but there is an example over in Vancouver, and then there's another one in Martha's Vineyard where they are, where they've come together as a community. One of them is kind of land banking, and the other one is putting a limit on on the ability for people to have a vacant home for a certain amount of time within their community. But it's a massive issue that we face, and the other one is around Airbnbs, and I'm not sure if that's the same in Auckland, but we need to have regulations on Airbnbs, because while we've got people living in vehicles, and many people living in vehicles and living down at beaches and in campgrounds and so on, people are making massive amounts of money off these Airbnbs. So people think of Waiheke as being this quite affluent place with 62 helicopter pads and billionaires, and it is that place, but it is also the home of a community that has been there for generations that is really, really struggling and getting pushed off the island that they know is home. So another example is from a legislation in the UK, which is the town country planning. So we're looking into that as well to see if there's something in there that we could advocate to central government to create changes around the vacant homes as well. But it's a really tricky one, and I can't even say how many community hui that we've had to try and solve empty houses. But the reality is we don't actually need to build any new houses on Waiheke. We have enough we have more homes than we have people that need them. We just need to open them up and get them to the people.
But to achieve that, I think we need to decommodify housing in terms of it should be a social right, not a commodity to be exploited. So you could easily radically increase. There's something 30,000 empty homes in Auckland, 100-odd thousand or more across the country that are empty. If you had a significant empty home tax imposed, that they either rent it out or give it to the state to rent out, protecting property rights over housing is the fundamental problem, and social housing is the only answer. But moving towards that, we need to make it make it difficult for the landlord class to exploit. And one way to do that, radically increase the number of houses that are available, including through a tax on empty homes as a start, I think.
Yep.
The Greens and Te Pāti Māori need to, in my opinion, make this a red line issue in the election campaign. If the Greens are in government, if Te Pāti Māori are in government, we will end the housing crisis. We will make Labour end the housing crisis. Good solutions have been proposed. We need rent controls, a rent freeze. I think Marama Davidson, co-leader of the Green Party, got in hot water for being the associate minister, but nonetheless saying we need a rent freeze, an immediate rent freeze. That was brave of her. Good on her for saying that. Empty house tax, 10,000 state houses until this problem is solved. And even bigger demand, limit the number of houses people can own, People don't need to own so many. I can't remember what the exact number in the IRD report was, but it was something like those 311 families earn, I can't remember if it was 70 or 700 properties each. It was one of those, I think. They own so many properties, they do not need them. Limit the number of houses people can own, because the housing crisis is probably the biggest way in which the inequality crisis, the poverty crisis expresses itself, and that would be so popular for the Greens and Te Pāti Māori to campaign on that. So that's what I say to you, Ricardo.
I found out recently that 80% of homes in Auckland are owned by people that own more than 10 houses, so I was pretty disgusted by that. Rent controls, empty home tax, maybe differential rates if you own shit tons of houses. We need to actually control like that as an industry, as a profiteering industry.
Sure. Anybody else? Yeah, yourself.
My name's Paul Stevens, and I'm from the PPTA. But in the interest of full disclosure, I'm also involved in the Labour Party. Although I feel like at this point I should be saying, perhaps for not for much longer, after the budget that we've seen. And look, I mean, I'll be honest. This kind of frustration, is present among people there too. And I think that but I think it's worth talking about education for a little bit. I've been a secondary school teacher for 10 years, and it's been mentioned this evening, some of the issues for teachers. And while in this budget there is some action in terms of equity for early childhood, and that's, I think, been a real focus, and that's kind of the question or comment I'd like to put to the floor around the focus of the Labour government on, as they put it, fixing some of those equity issues, and particularly through the public sector pay adjustment, taking an approach toward the public sector at the moment, which says that we need to bring up those on the lowest wages within the public sector. And I'm sure there's no one here who would disagree with that. But the idea that that's enough for anyone in the public sector, and that anyone else in the public sector isn't needing a pay rise, while we can't get teachers. We can't get people into our classrooms to teach our young people, and the job gets harder every single day, and you're seeing passionate people who love the work leaving it because they actually can't do it. And I mean, I'm the regional chair for the PPTA, and so I'm reading through our hardship grant applications from teachers. And there's a certain point there where you just go, if it's called the Labour Party, and part of my frustration is being a part of it and seeing the sense that they won't listen, and that the triangulation and the spirit of liberalism within the party is so strong that they will not listen to the ground anymore. And it brings me to a point of saying, we say replace the Westminster system, and you go, well, if we aren't able to respond to the issues as they are, and the Ministry of Education, quite frankly, and I hate to say it because it's actually an area where I can't help but agree with David Seymour, where some of our ministries are incredibly bloated when it comes to responding to the issues. And I'm saying that in regard to the Ministry of Education, because we have a Ministry of Education that won't back teachers, who are lying to our ministers about the retention issues because they have a managerial system, right, where they want to keep their jobs and they want to have their jobs separate from the ground, and they've got no clue what's going on the ground. And so money that does go into education doesn't end up where it needs to be. And the last point I'd make, without doing a rant without being on the panel, is that our operations grant for schools, right? So this is the grant to keep our schools lights on in the middle of the rising costs. It's less than half of inflation. Less than half of inflation in this recent budget. So they are literally a Labour government it is cutting education spending. Now, why is that not on the paper?
Oh my God.
You did.
Not just not to make this pitch as a transition to the Labour to perhaps another party, but having been at Parliament welcoming the strike several times, and often actually being the only party there responding to the strikes, it's really clear that the challenges around education go beyond, like, it is pay, but like I think you make a really good point around resourcing things like class sizes, sick leave, that it is about the working conditions that make the profession an attractive thing. And I think it goes the same with like nurses and other health, like other professions in the public sector. Yeah, essential workers. And that like for us, it goes back even to the conversation we had a few years ago around this like public sector pay freeze as well, that I think affected like people across the board. But it set out this narrative that I think has been so unhelpful around the public sector, where it's like politicians talk about the public sector as like just bureaucrats, and actually our public sector are some of our includes some of our most essential workers, and yet the narrative from the right has seeped into kind of Labour talking about public sector as just like, oh, it's just bureaucrats, and then we don't get the government then backing our teachers in the way that it should. And so I agree with you that education is key, but it's key because it flows on to so many of our other issues that we talk about, right? I mean, not that you can't pay your rent with a degree, but education still can give you the tools to actually like do so much more and to thrive as well. And so like looking at all the determinants of things like health and other things, without education as a core to progressive government decision making, we're not going to get anywhere. So I just want to say sort of back what you're saying, but and just want to amplify that it is so much more than just the pay. It's all the other things you mentioned. Yeah.
All of the systems we have in the government are neoliberal creations that hate workers. They think workers are the problem, right? They think workers, the workers in the health system are the problem. The workers in the education system are the problem. The workers everywhere are the problem. They create bureaucracies and managerial structures on hugely bloated salaries and pay. It's true. It's enormously wasteful and corrupt. And it's designed to prevent working people being able to make the decisions themselves, because the health system should be run by health workers. When they set up the 22 health boards, they created whole layers of management. Management grew after that, those creations at 2-3 times the rate of the workers, right? The managerial structures grew 2-3 times the rate as the number of voices. I'm sure it's true in education everywhere else. You've got to trust the people who work there. Workers' control should be promoted, and let the nurses and the doctors and the teachers make the decisions in their schools about what's best for their children, and trust them. Trust them.
I mean, I just want to agree with everything that you said, Paul, but also, like, from organising the climate strikes, we've been taking, like, submissions of different chants the people, you know, the youth want to see in the climate strikes, and one that's come up a lot is, like, teachers' lives and climate strikes, same fight, same fight. So we'd love to be supporting you and anything that we can do with the climate movement to tōtoko. It's the same fight.
And teachers should strike on the climate strike.
Yeah, teachers should strike on the climate strike.
Yeah, everyone's following but we need the right to strike.
Yeah. We could have a general strike almost with all these unions coming through.
Is it coming?
We need the right to strike, though. That's another thing that we need to see.
Solidarity strikes.
Political strikes. And at the minute, workers can only strike for two reasons. So one is health and safety, though you could argue the climate catastrophe, health and safety issue, the biggest one.
Joe, you may just want the microphone.
And then the second is
During bargaining. But we have
Yes.
lots of bargaining, a lot more bargaining, because they won't settle. So there are multiple.
But
More
you can't
opportunities.
strike when a fair pay agreement is being negotiated.
We put an
Sorry.
amendment. We put an amendment to change that.
Oh,
We tried.
honestly,
We tried.
It's just, you know, serves as a way to moderate people's wage demands. Like fair pay agreements being everybody's salvation. What a crock. Seriously, it's not your salvation. Like paid employment is your salvation. No, it isn't, is it? When you have working for families, when you've got working people on an accommodation supplement. We sold such a load of bullshit. Sorry, kia ora koutou, I'm Sarah from the, I work at the nurses organisation. I've had the, you know, I've been real ill for a while, so I've had to, you know, interact with the primary healthcare system, and it's really expensive. It's been I've had shingles. And I just comment about what you said, Ricardo. I noticed that Chris Luxon offered nurses to pay $20,000 of their student loan back. And I didn't see any rebuttal. I didn't see anybody one-upping that on Chris. I didn't see any of my own union leadership. All they went, that's not going to go far enough. Nah, but you know what? Nobody said free all the tertiary education. Because all of the young people have the biggest challenge coming up, for which we probably need a skilled and educated actual workforce for. Anyway, I've had a lot of time to get...
Abolish the student debt.
Yeah. Cancel my debt. So Chris Luxon probably just scored 20-something thousand nurses' votes. The nurses' union didn't make any counter proposal. It just chants, what do we want? More nurses. When do we want it now? It's just like, have you got any creative ideas about how to do that? Just saying. Anyway...
Another one that came up was nurses' wage and climate change. Same fight.
Absolutely, but we need to educate our members and our communities and have these kind of discussions with people that we come into contact with, because when I talk to members, they still have that culture that you were talking about. They'll go, oh yeah, but I guess the country can't afford it. Stuff like that. Anyway, kumatu. Thank you.
Hi everybody, thank you passionate speakers, it was wonderful as always. Ko Christina Ho, I'm got a community project called Time Banking, and it's a way to share without money skills in the community. I'm expecting some more members because, that's when things are tough, the Time Bank movement gets a little push. It's not here to talk about time banking, but it is about what we can do right now to make our lives more easier. Like the Time Bank has been doing, helping each other in just these beautiful ways, like driving people instead of Ubering and taking people to appointments. And so I wanted to say something really about the empathy that isn't around anymore, and how understanding somebody else's plight is so separate from what I see when I hear people talk in their lives. They're so stressed. My friend's just had to quit her job because she was so stressed. She had chronic pain. She's got, it's just ridiculous. And it's been going on for too long because she's trying to save for a house in Auckland. It's ridiculous. And so now she's on a sickness benefit. So back in the day, National actually supported rent to own. That was in the 70s. And now that would never come out of their mouths. It's just like we need to take back what is normal. It's normal to support people that need it. And it's normal for wealth to be equally distributed. And it's normal. That's what we want. And if we start the narrative and we start normalising it and we start hearing it in the coffee shops as we hear people, instead of saying, oh yeah, like what you said, Sophie, where how the rich are saying, actually it would be okay if we got a bit more tax. Why can't those people be speaking up a bit louder and maybe coming to a meeting where they're saying, actually it's okay to tax me, and having that voice from the other side cross the floor and say, hang on a minute, this is not the New Zealand I want to live in. Because there are people in this country that are doing really well that are not happy with how much money they have to spend putting security on their house and on their car, and how they have to install more things so that they can watch people as they steal something out of the back of their car. It's ridiculous. So tax the rich. I like the word fair tax because so many people, in my view, don't see themselves as rich, but they see themselves as not knowing. But fair tax is sort of this neutral thing. It's like, well, we want fair tax because we can see that will create fairness. I'm all for wealth tax by all means, but so that, what else did I say? I think they might do. Yeah.
Anybody else from the audience? Yeah, Susan. So first Susan, then yourself, and then yourself.
Hi, I'm Susan. I trained as a primary school teacher. I moved out of it because I burnt out about 3 years ago, and I moved into specialist teaching of the deaf. So I have quite a interest. I also lived in Waiheke, and I actually moved off the island because rentals got too expensive. So for me and my family, so yeah, that was interesting. The point I kind of get a bit frustrated with is that it feels like the government does not see what education is for our country, our communities, our society. And I just have to go back to, at the moment, National are busy going, we need to change the curriculum because it's not good enough and we've got failing students. And I look at it because I used to work, I've actually worked in early childhood as well, and I worked as a new entrance teacher, and I've worked at all levels of primary school, and now I also work at all levels. So I've seen a good range of poverty in education with our families coming in. You know, we talk about our children being ready to learn at the age of 5, and in the last 15 years that I've been teaching, I have noticed that the students we get are coming to our schools just not ready to learn because they're just not getting that basic, you know, human right to live and to thrive in their families because there's just poverty everywhere. So I get really frustrated when I hear National going, we need to change the curriculum because our students are failing, they're illiterate, and you're going, that's because teachers are trying to get students to a level where they're actually ready to learn. It just doesn't happen. This has become a teacher's responsibility, and it's not our families failing. Our families are not failing us. It's the government that's failing us. It's the fact that this is just so overlooked that the reason why our kids are not getting the education that they deserve is not because teachers are not putting time and love and energy into it. It's actually that they're just needing nurturing. They need those things that they're just not getting. They're not getting the houses. They're not getting their families getting paid enough. They've got parents who are working more than one job, and the friggin' secondary tax, which is ridiculous. And I just see it, you know, we're feeding these kids because there's not enough food for their families because they're not earning enough. And I absolutely agree with the whole tax the friggin' rich because this is ridiculous. It's just ridiculous that it's so obvious. You know, when you look at it and you go, it's just such an obvious place, and it's heartbreaking to see the rich getting richer. It really is. Sorry, I'm now upset.
Hi, I'm Samuel. I have I'm not trying to introduce myself. I have a background studying history and English and music, so a bit of a humanities background. But I'm currently in a really precarious part-time job situation, which a lot of people are after doing arts degrees, where I just do a bit of tutoring, but that's like really precarious and you know so forth. But I won't rant about that because I want to get to the question that I want to ask. But anyway, so the question I had was to particularly, I think anyone can answer this, but it's more directly to Elliot, because this is a question I had based off the article he wrote for Spin-Off fairly recently. So regarding the taxing of the rich, and in particular how you said how you want billionaires not to exist, you know like they should have 100%. How does that? My question is like, so I agree with you firstly that this is what needs to happen, but how do we actually do that, and how do we make it effective? And I was glad to hear, or shocked to hear actually, that they actually are, from Sephora was saying, how they actually are people willing to pay tax more. And so the question I have based on all that is kind of just like, I probably have several questions based on that, but like my main question is just like, how do we make it effective? How do we practically implement and make it effective for the richest people in society to actually be willing to be taxed? Because that's the main question I have. So
I'll just get the speakers to come back at the end, and then yourself.
Hi everyone, my name's Michael from the Platypus Affiliated Society. That was really provocative, engaging, and I found pretty much everything everyone had to say really stimulating and interesting. I was interested in thinking about the commonalities between what everyone spoke on today in terms of how it's, I suppose, fits into historical context. So maybe it's a bit of a broader question, I don't know, I'll try to be as kind of clear as I can. There was this kind of emphasis I noticed on addressing this matter of like civil society and how do we relate to the state, you know, if we understand ourselves as subjects of this collection of organizations, organized parties that manage the discontents of society, right? And they invest money and then sometimes they don't, and that produces its own kind of series of crises. Now this kind of like emphasis on taxing the rich, progressive taxation, it's probably no secret to those in the room tonight that, you know, that was traditionally a socialist demand. Luxembourg advocated for it. I was even reading just before, I was like trying to do some research and just thinking more about this issue, like even Proudhon, an anarchist, advocated for taxing the state. So there's nothing that's specifically bound up or originally bound up in this conception of the state or government necessarily. In fact, it goes back to the origins of like bourgeois society. Even Adam Smith, who's not a socialist, of course, but you know he was advocating for the wealth of those who labour to be redistributed back within society. So that kind of gets me to my question. Practically, I'm wondering how we can reflect on how much the state can act in workers' interests and in the people's interests generally, no matter how good-willed the state's interests might be. And you know, I'm not criticising reformism necessarily. Like I'd like to see it as much the next person, but I want to know like what you guys think about how we can work through this problem, because we can appeal to labour or we can try and replace labour, but in terms of means and ends, what's the outcome? Where does this get us in 10 years, 20 years time? So we're not repeating the mistakes of the past that the leftists may or may not have made. Cool, thank you.
Jason?
Actually, no. I won't ask you a question, so I'll just listen for a minute.
Okay.
Sorry.
Yep.
Anybody else? Because I'll get the speakers to respond to some of those questions at the end. So just, is there any final things that people would like to say? No? Okay. Well, I'll get each one of our speakers maybe to speak for about 2 or 3 minutes. Is that okay? So I'll take it in this order.
I'm okay for it to go straight to you.
Okay.
Yep, that's cool.
I think we need to try to put forward a set of demands that meet the needs of the situation, and which are radical demands, but not pigeonhole them as either reformist or revolutionary, because in many cases they're both and always are both. There are reforms that we put forward for society as it is, but they transition towards a different form of society whereby we're sort of, I think, decommodifying society away from being based on commodity production for profit towards social production for need, and that's ultimately socialism. I want to put one little caveat on, which is a little thing that I think about. I've been trying to think about how do we that's different from that, right? Because we need a government to do that. I think that's true, and we can't preclude. If we're going to argue for something, we can't preclude any parties in those governments advancing in that direction. Otherwise, you wouldn't make the demand, right? So, even though you might suspect that the Labour Party it's going to be extraordinarily difficult for Labour to actually meet any of these demands, and as it's currently constituted. So there's another side that I want to throw in, that I think we need also to focus on an element that is often missing. So we're looking at what governments do, and I think we need to look at what empowering people at a grassroots level to engage in politics and effect change and take control of their lives. And I came up with a schema. It's sort of a little schematic, but it's based on our Māori experience in a sense, right? Turn every school into a marae of their community and empower that school to be open for the community. We have the theatre, we have sport, we have community gardens, we have community kitchens, we have advocates, we have citizens' advice, we have whatever we need, and we're paying for these things to sit dead 80% of the time when they could be open and vibrant and 24 hours a day. Community centres and places where people can commune, can talk to each other, where children can help care for the elderly in the community, and we create new communities, not these isolated homes that we currently have, you know. So yeah, that's one of my little dreams that I would like to see part of this program, because I think we need that people's power as well as whatever governmental solutions we want.
I mean, yeah, I'm not an expert on like tax and all that shit, but how do we tax the rich? Like, I mean, how did we get women's rights to vote? How did we get gay marriage legalized? How did we get workers' rights? Like, we engaged with politics. We demanded better from our government. And I think we need to just start doing that. So please come to the climate strike. Please take a poster and put it up in your supermarket. Or, you know, if it's not hard to participate, but it's scary to participate because you have to start dancing with the devil. But it's time.
I don't have an answer to all the questions, but look, the way we start building a movement is the way we've always started building movements. We set up a change.org platform and take it from there, right? I mean, I very much, I come from, my way of doing things is a very much a reformist approach. I have revolutionary ideas, but I work on reformist issues, and I'm glad that Mike sort of looked at the tension between those two things. I think we have to, you know, you choose front lines, you choose winnable issues, and you build movements around winnable issues. And it's only by winning that workers have the experience, or social groups have the experience, that we have power, we have momentum, and that when we withdraw our labour on the day that happens, in the instance that happens, that capitalists stop making profit. We also just, I mean, and I've tried to do it so far today, but we have to talk about profit. Like, profit is that component of our wages that we don't get. And I referred to, you know, the profit in 2022 was $70 billion across the economy. That's the declared profit, of course, and there's a whole lot of profit that doesn't get declared and it gets hidden through a whole bunch of clever financial transactions. But that amount is $15 per hour for every hour worked in the year 2022. And that's the highest proportion that we've ever had, $15 per hour. We need to start thinking about taking back our $15 per hour. You know, $15 per hour given back to working people makes a major difference. And I say this from a kind of reformist perspective, because the more that we can think about claiming that $15 per hour back on top of our existing wage, be we minimum wage workers or somewhere around the living wage, the more that we can think about, well, if we can do that, then maybe we can start doing other things. Maybe we can develop a Ministry of Green Works that can deliver 100,000 state houses within the next 5 years. Maybe we can take back our electricity companies into public ownership so that we can start producing green energy for the people on a regular basis. Maybe we can start building a health system that puts social health first, that builds real healthy communities. Maybe we can think about an education system that doesn't keep throwing subsidies at that guy who's funding the platform. You know, we can do all of this stuff, but we need to start winning. We need to find very small things that we can win, and we need to experience how good that is, and then try and build a movement from there.
I'm gonna answer those two questions in the opposite order. So firstly, what was your name again, sorry? Michael, you mentioned Rosa Luxemburg, whose portrait is up there behind you. She was a revolutionary and was famous for writing about the struggle between reform or revolution, and how revolution is ultimately the only way we're going to get rid of capitalism. But she also said revolutions are the toughest fighters for reform. She wasn't saying don't try and reform things because you can only change it through that. She's saying if you're trying to fix the system, you're not even going to win those reforms. If you're actually fighting, if you're trying to mobilize people from below, mobilize the mass of the working class to fight back, you're going to start with reforms. If you go to most workers, say we need to overthrow the system tomorrow, they're going to say that's not going to happen, is it? But if you go say we need to tax the rich tomorrow, they'll go, yeah, we do. Ricardo shared a poll on his Instagram the other day. 53% of people want to tax the rich. Only, I think, 34% were opposed. I think, what poll was that? News Hub or something? I can't remember. Yeah. I just saw it on your Insta. So, revolutionaries are the toughest fighters for reforms. If we actually want to fight the system, which we do, we need to be saying things which will make sense to people in the here and now. In terms of how do we tax the rich, firstly, taxes on the rich used to be much higher. I think before Roger Douglas ripped up our economy and restructured it in favour of the rich, corporation tax was 48% instead of 28%. The top income tax rate was 66% instead of 33%. GST didn't exist. So those kind of things have been shown to work in the past. Specific tax policies, I mentioned quite a few in the article I wrote. Wealth tax, capital gains tax, raise corporation tax, raise top tax rate on the very highest earners. In order to make those demands popular, although they already are popular, as that poll showed, I think we need to do what Jeremy Corbyn did in his remarkably successful 2017 election campaign, where everything was against him and he managed to turn things around and nearly win the election. He said only the top 5% will pay more tax. And every time they tried to say, he's going to raise taxes for you, you go, no, only the top 5%. And then I think you can take that one step further by saying we're going to cut tax for most people. We're going to abolish GST, cut income tax for the bottom, or abolish income tax for the first 25,000 is what I suggested, and then say we're going to pay for all of that through taxing the rich. But they will try and avoid that tax. And so ultimately it has to be from a government which is utterly unprepared to compromise with the top 1%, which exists entirely for the workers. I believe that needs to be a socialist government. If they're refusing to pay taxes, we're going to need to start taking wealth off them directly. Take their companies away if they refuse to pay tax. Take their houses away. No one should own that many houses. Start changing how ownership works as well as just tax. But the initial popular demand, tax the rich, I think that's a really popular thing to fight for right now, and so we should.
I just want to acknowledge you, Susan. Thank you for what you shared, and thank you for all the work that you're doing in our communities, for all our babies. I really felt you when you got emo, so same. I think that, honestly, it comes back to us unpacking our beliefs. I think when we talk about a colonial settler state, there's violence, but actually racism. And racism is the idea that some of us are better than others. And I think that exists across all of us now. And I think I want to shout out to mana whenua movements, actually, and reclamation movements, and who have had to deal with the violence of the Crown. I think that if we're not in solidarity with mana whenua movements, and vice versa, then we're not going to be able to fight for systems change, which is constitutional transformation via Matike Mai. There are other ways of doing things and living together, and I think we often miss that. A quote around, it's easier to imagine the death of the end of the world instead of the end of capitalism. but we have so many other ways that, like, Indigenous peoples and communities have lived. Like, poverty doesn't even, the word poverty didn't even exist in Te Ao Māori, and it didn't exist in Indigenous communities, and that's because it didn't exist. Poverty doesn't exist in nature as a system. And so there are so many other ways in which we can live and interact and be together as people. And I think we need to look to those ways, unpack our belief systems, believe that actually all of us are equal, because money is a way of measuring our wealth and our power. And that translates to power within this system. But like the communities that I work with, you know, they're deemed like impoverished or marginalised by the system. The system has determined that of these communities. No one in these communities would see themselves as that, and I would never see them as that neither. These are people, actually, that we've forgotten about. The system has violently forced for them to forget in their own power. And I think it's us remembering in our own power as individuals, but that our power doesn't come at the expense of others. It doesn't come at the expense of rangi or papa. And that if we remember in that and come together in solidarity and fight for actually a way in which we can all be equal, where it could actually, because none of us are free until all of us are free. So
nice. Basically what she said. But Susan, just wanted to acknowledge your whakaaro, and I think this is why I love our frontline workers, because I think you often are the ones who see things in that ecological framework that the Greens talk a lot about, you know, that interconnectedness of things. And like for you, you know, your what you said about you as a teacher, your job being made harder by the fact that kids are not having what they need, and you advocating both for improved conditions for your profession, but actually for the kids that you serve. And I think that's just such a great way to view things in general. And we're going to have to do a lot of work to unpack why the government is cutting in practice basically the disability allowance and temporary additional support, which, yeah, talks about what you said. I'm kind of echoing what has been said. I'm a walking contradiction in that I'm an MP, but I do dream of a world past governance structures built on violence. And I think this is kind of what Brooke said was so important in that, yes, like I'm constantly working towards reforms. And every time I put an amendment, like the right to strike during fair pay agreement negotiations, like it is a reform. But for me, it's about a step towards the goalpost and I think it's important for us to like allow ourselves to dream of that goalpost of what that ideal future looks like. Because while I get what Ed was saying in terms of like, yes, we've got to focus on the small wins because that lets people kind of see that they can win. I mean, I always think of like the fact that the system has created the conditions for us to find it really hard to dream of what that can look like. And like a lot of the reforms I feel like we're working towards is by allowing people to slow down, to reconnect with one another, to reconnect with nature, to their cultures, and that reconnection in a way is what allows us to dream of what like things could be like. Like what if life was a bit slower? What if we worked 4 days a week and not 5 days a week? And you know, ideally for some who do get to work just 5 days a week, when so many are working 7. And I think, well, it's like, no, but like our teachers, like, right, who are having to take up multiple jobs to just make ends meet. I'm not projecting as the MP. But yeah, and so I think that way of working, I feel, is also part of the solution of kind of having spaces where we can collectively dream of what that end goal looks like. And there are frameworks, and like Matika Mai does lay out in some ways that journey. And I think it's so important that we kind of also lean on what other people who have collectively dreamed for that future to work towards that. Yeah, kia ora.
All right, well, I'd like to thank all our speakers tonight, so give them a round of applause. And lastly, this isn't just a talking shop. We're going to put these ideas into action, right? So hands up everybody who would support a mobilisation, a march, a big protest to tax the rich. And we want to start popularising this. We want to take it out from being a dream to actually being an election issue to intersect with this election. Labour are going to lose support in this election because they haven't done things for teachers, nurses, firefighters. They haven't done anything on the housing crisis. Not really. It's got worse. Housing has got worse rather than better. And lots of people are struggling to survive with runaway inflation at the minute and low wages. Even if we fight for living wages, they're gone within 6 months. So I think this is the time to bring movements together, you know, to bring the brown, the red and the green, as we said, together, because all of us benefit if Māori benefit, right? It's shocking to see people, Raupehu, going on again, whether they're taking the state land, 2/3 of it being given to developers to build limited state housing, you know, 2/3 being taken. People being driven off Waiheke, where they've lived for generations, so the rich can come in and build helicopter pads, right? Is this what's going to happen? It is going to happen. It's going to continue. It's going to get worse. As we've seen with austerity in Europe 10 years ago, that's coming to New Zealand in the next few years. You haven't felt this pain. You did in the 80s, sure, when the shock doctrine, the shit out of this country. But austerity is going to hit hard in the next few years with the next economic crisis. If you've seen that tidal wave with COVID, and the next big tidal wave coming with austerity, and then the huge one coming with climate change in the next 10 years. That's what we're facing. We need to change the system. Let's start by mobilising people to take on the real enemy, which is the tiny amount of rich, right? And I think we talked about, you know, am I rich because my house is worth $1 million? Not really. You know, your house is overinflated, right? You'll soon find out the reality of the price of your house quite soon when the property market collapses. But we need to talk about who are the real enemy, and that's the billionaires. You know, they're a tiny amount of people on this planet, 270 of them. If they want to go into space, we can organise that for them. Off you go. Yeah, but I mean, that is seriously the tiny amount of people. When we talked about Occupy Wall Street, Occupy Auckland 10 years ago, it was like the 1%. Yeah, remember that slogan? We're the 99%, they're the 1%. They're not even the 1%, they're the 0.01%. And that's the kind of, well, when we say tax the rich, that's the kind of people we're talking about. We're talking about McDonald's earning, you know, 160 million in profit. The food duopoly, Countdown and the other foodstuffs, you know, huge amounts of wealth being made all the time as the people who work and create that wealth are living in poverty. If we talked about reform or revolution, revolution is not formed because people read all the works of Karl Marx or Lenin down there. People wanted peace, bread and land. And people said, we'll give you peace, bread and land. Now we want a home. We want food that we can afford, and we want services, you know. I think that's how people will mobilise on the streets with this. Let's start quite soon by marching to tax the rich. We'll talk to everybody how we think we could best do that together, and look for the dead. So thank you for coming on this very climate changey night. But you're now settled down. You're more than welcome to stay with us, have a few drinks, get to know some of the people who talked here. You're very welcome to Unite Union. And I just asked Bianca to close our meeting tonight.
Wait, I don't need that. Can everybody hear?
we're not going to film the karakia, eh? Anyway, so I'll just close us off in a karakia. Yeah, kia inui tātou. Whakairia te tapu, kia wātea ai te ara. Hakatūruki ki taha ai, hakatūruhi ki taka ai. Tūturu whakamaua kia tīna. Tīna. Huiei tai ki.
Final shout out for the climate strike, because our main demand for Tamaki Makaurau is around the budget cuts for this climate strike. And also if there's other things you want to get amongst, then there's Community Coalition Against Cuts, which will be going to the public meetings where Wayne Brown is proposing to sell our strategic assets and austerity, and we're going to be just showing face at those on the 8th of June and the 26th of June. Check us out on Facebook, Community Coalition Against Cuts and Fridays for the Future. Always